He is risen. Could you imagine being there? Like being there right there, very early on that first Easter morning. You woke up really early, you go to Jesus' tomb, and you find out he isn't there anymore. And then a glowing dude shows up and says, "Oh yeah, Jesus isn't here." I'm like, yeah, I can tell he's not here. Thanks for that bit of helpful information. He's not in the tomb, therefore he's not here. And then the glowing dude says, "He is risen." And they go, "Wait, what? He is what now?" Well, like I said, it actually kind of works. It would be weird. And I can imagine being there because I think I know who I would be in the story. I would be one of Jesus' other disciples who hear the women saying that Jesus isn't in the tomb anymore and he rose from the dead just like he said it would, and I would be going, "Yeah, right, sure he is. Go back to bed." Because that's weird, right? People don't just rise from the dead. It was a little strange. And you especially don't come back from a crucifixion. They made darn sure that you don't come back from a crucifixion. In fact, because the person in charge of the crucifixion, if the person who was being crucified didn't get killed, they would. You don't want to be the person in charge of a crucifixion. I feel bad for that centurion who had his great profession of faith when Jesus was on the cross, and then Jesus all of a sudden isn't dead, and he's like, "Oh, I'm in trouble now." So you might be thinking, why do I think I'm one of the doubting disciples? I'm a pastor, right? I'm supposed to always believe God all the time, but no, if I was one of those disciples, I would not listen to those women. Because it's interesting to me that there are 3 different reactions to the resurrection in the Gospel of Luke. There's the women who believe immediately. They're like, "Yep, we're on board with this. Jesus is risen from the dead. This is great." Then there's the disciples. The other, probably 100 or so of them, who are like, "Nah, he's not risen from the dead. It can't be true." And then there's Peter. Peter has an interesting third reaction. Now, we can get behind the women, that makes sense. They're just like, "Yep, Jesus rose from the dead. We all can kind of agree because we're probably here today. Jesus rose from the dead." We can get that. We can also kind of get the disciples going, "Well, he might be rose from the dead, but let's hold off judgment until we know for sure because it's still very early in the morning and I think you haven't slept." So we can follow that, but Peter's reaction, I think, is both the most interesting and the most accurate. Because I think Peter is scared to death that the resurrection might be true. Why would Peter think that? Why would Peter be so scared of the resurrection being true? Well, if you remember, Peter, the very last thing Jesus saw Peter do was deny that he knew Jesus. The very last thing Peter did when Jesus was alive was pretend he didn't even know him. And so now Peter hears that Jesus is risen from the dead, and he's like, "Oh, I'm in trouble." Because we all have moments, you say something mean to somebody and then, or you do something bad to somebody, and then all of a sudden you have a long span of time before you can apologize for that. And it just kind of eats you up and you feel terrible. Or in Peter's case, you do something terrible to your best friend and then he dies. And Peter's got to be sitting there going like, "Oh man, I just ruined everything. And now he rose from the dead?" He's either going, "I can make this better now," or "I'm in deep trouble." And so Peter runs to the tomb to find out, is Jesus really not there? And then he walks away going, what do I do? What do I do? Because of all the disciples, Peter is the only one who explicitly said, "I do not know Jesus." So you've got the women excited that Jesus is back. You've got the disciples who just don't believe, and you've got poor Peter. Because in Luke's gospel, Jesus just kind of shows up and then Peter's all of a sudden okay. But there's another scene in John's gospel that is really kind of cool because Peter goes fishing. Peter's stressed. He goes fishing. Some of us can relate to that. I can't. Fishing stresses me out. But some of us can relate to that. So Peter ends up going fishing. Jesus shows up when he's fishing. And then Jesus is the one who reaches out to Peter to make things right. Jesus is the one who says, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you really love me? Asking for 3 declarations of love to balance out the 3 declarations of denial that Peter said earlier. Jesus takes the first step, forgives Peter for denying him, and then Peter goes on to be kind of a big deal. Because while Peter is sitting there going, what if Jesus doesn't want me anymore? Jesus is proving otherwise. While Peter thinks that he's done something so terrible that Jesus would want nothing to do with him, Jesus reaches out to him. And he gives him the same command that Peter got at the beginning. Jesus says to him, follow me. Today we celebrate Jesus' resurrection, and I think we fall into those 3 camps. We either believe, we don't believe, or we're afraid to believe. There could be any number of reasons why we might be afraid of what Jesus might think of us. But the truth is that Jesus died and rose again because we're afraid of what he might think of us. He did all of the work for us because we can't on our own. And like Jesus reaches out to Peter, he also reaches out to us. He reaches out to us and says, I forgive you. Your sins don't matter. The things that you think you did don't matter. I love you. I died for you. I rose again so that you can live and not be worried and guilted and just concerned about all of the sin that you have. That is the greatest news of the resurrection. Because he is risen, but he is risen to give us life. He is risen to give us hope. He is risen to forgive us. That is good news. Because even if you did something terrible, forgiveness is there. Even if you don't believe, God is still there. And if you do believe, well, you knew all this already. And that is what we celebrate today. Jesus risen from the dead for each and every one of us, no matter who we are and what we have done. That is truly the good news. He is risen.